Imagine a knock on your door in the dead of night, not by thieves but by figures cloaked in shadow, representing an authority more absolute than the king himself. They don't need a warrant. They don't need evidence you can see. All they need is a whisper, an anonymous accusation. Your property is seized, your family is left behind, and you are swallowed by the darkness of a secret prison. You don't know who accused you, or even what crime you've allegedly committed. This was the terrifying reality for countless individuals during one of history's most infamous periods. This was the beginning of a journey into the heart of the Spanish Inquisition. For over 3.5 centuries, this institution wielded immense power, ostensibly to purify the Catholic faith. But its methods were far from divine. It perfected a system of psychological and physical torment so effective, so meticulously documented, that its legacy has become a synonym for cruelty and intolerance. We're about to descend into the cold, damp dungeons of the Inquisition to uncover the truth behind the instruments of pain and the mechanisms of fear. We will explore the journey from accusation to the final, public spectacle of judgment. This is the story of how an institution, in the name of God, unleashed hell on earth. The process rarely began with a dramatic confrontation. It started quietly, with a seed of suspicion planted in the fertile ground of fear. The Inquisition would often announce an edict of grace upon arriving in a town. This was a deceptive olive branch, a period of 30 to 40 days where heretics could voluntarily confess their sins, denounce themselves, and receive a lighter penance. It sounded merciful, but it was a brilliant trap. To prove their sincerity, confessors were required to expose all other heretics they knew. Friends were turned against friends, children against parents, neighbors against neighbors. A web of accusations would quickly ensnare the entire community, fueled by old grudges, personal rivalries, and genuine religious panic. An anonymous accusation was all it took. A special box was often placed in local churches where anyone could deposit a written denunciation without revealing their identity. Your name could be dropped by a business rival, a scorned lover, or a debtor looking to erase their obligations. Once the Inquisition had its target, the arrest was swift and terrifying. The familiars, the lay associates of the Holy Office, would arrive at your home, usually under the cover of darkness to minimize public disturbance and maximize shock. There was no resistance. To resist was to confirm your guilt. Your assets, your home, your money, everything you owned was immediately inventoried and confiscated by the Inquisition. This served two purposes. It covered the costs of your imprisonment and trial, and it left your family destitute and powerless to help you. You were now utterly alone, a prisoner of the Holy Office. The prisons of the Inquisition were not the common, filthy dungeons of the secular authorities. They were often cleaner, providing a basic level of sustenance. This wasn't an act of kindness. It was a calculated strategy. The goal of the Inquisition was not to kill the body, but to break the spirit and save the soul through confession. A dead prisoner cannot confess. The true torture began with psychological torment. The accused was held in solitary confinement, sometimes for months, even years. This profound isolation was designed to erode their will to resist. They were left to agonize in silence, replaying every conversation, every action, every prayer of their life, desperately trying to guess the nature of the charge against them. The interrogations, when they finally came, were masterpieces of psychological manipulation. You would be led into a stark, intimidating chamber. Seated before you would be the inquisitors, usually learned theologians and legal experts, their faces impassive. A notary would be present, meticulously recording every word, every sigh, every hesitation. This obsession with record-keeping gave the entire horrifying procedure a veneer of bureaucratic legitimacy. The questions would begin. They would not tell you the charges. Instead, they would implore you to search your conscience and confess your sins against the faith. They would ask vague, probing questions about your life, your associates, your beliefs. Do you know why you are here? They would ask. Have you strayed from the path of the true faith? They were fishing, using your own fearful answers to build a case. They would present you with fragments of testimony from anonymous witnesses, twisted and taken out of context, trying to catch you in a lie. Imagine being told, a witness claims that on the third Sunday after Easter you refused to eat pork. You might deny it, but then they would press harder. Why would a good Catholic lie about you? Perhaps your memory is failing. Perhaps you should confess. This process could go on for an endless series of sessions, spread out over weeks and months. The constant uncertainty, the isolation, and the mental gymnastics required to defend yourself against unknown accusations from unknown accusers would grind even the strongest mind into dust. The inquisitors saw themselves as spiritual fathers, patiently guiding a lost sheep back to the flock. But if patience and psychological pressure failed to produce the desired confession, they had other methods. They had the authority to introduce a more persuasive form of questioning. They would decide to put you to the question. This was the euphemism for torture. Officially, torture was a last resort, governed by a strict set of rules. It was to be used only when there was significant evidence of heresy, but the accused stubbornly refused to confess. A physician was required to be present to assess the victim's health and advise the torturers if they were nearing their physical limits. The goal, they claimed, was not to maim or kill, but simply to apply enough pressure to break the silence and let the truth flow out. The rules also stated that a victim could only be subjected to torture once, but the inquisitors devised a cruel legal loophole to circumvent this. A torture session was never completed. It was merely suspended or interrupted if the victim fainted or the physician advised a stop. This meant the inquisitors could bring the prisoner back days or weeks later to continue the session, subjecting them to the same agony again and again, all while technically adhering to the one-session rule. The transition from interrogation to torture was a formal, chilling affair. The accused would be led from the audience chamber to a different room, the Camara del Tormento, or torture chamber. Here, the instruments of their ordeal were displayed openly. The inquisitors would make a final plea for confession, describing in graphic detail what was about to happen. This final chance to confess, with the tools of agony in plain sight, was itself a form of psychological torture, and for many, it was enough to break them completely. But for those who still maintained their innocence, the physical ordeal was about to begin. Let's examine the three primary methods favored by the Spanish Inquisition, devices renowned for their horrifying effectiveness. First, there was the garrocha, more commonly known as the strupado. The prisoner's hands were tied behind their back. The rope was then looped over a pulley on the ceiling, and the victim was hoisted several feet into the air. They would be left hanging there, the full weight of their body pulling on their shoulder joints, causing immense pain. This was just the beginning. After a series of questions were met with denial, the torturer would release the rope, allowing the victim to plummet towards the floor, only to be jerked to a sudden, violent halt just inches from impact. The shock was devastating. The force of the drop would often rip the shoulder sockets apart, dislocating both arms with an audible pop. Muscles and ligaments would tear. The pain was blinding, a white-hot agony that overwhelmed the senses. If a confession was not forthcoming, they would be hoisted up and dropped again, and again, until their arms were rendered useless or they mercifully lost consciousness. Next was the patro, or the rack. This device is perhaps the most infamous instrument of torture in history. It was a simple but diabolically effective design, a rectangular wooden frame, often with a roller at each end. The victim was laid flat on the frame, their wrists and ankles securely tied to the rollers. An inquisitor would ask a question. If the answer was unsatisfactory, the torturer would turn the handles connected to the rollers. With each turn, the ropes tightened, stretching the victim's body. The initial sensation was one of intense pressure, but this quickly escalated into excruciating pain as joints began to strain. The torturer, guided by the inquisitors, would apply the pressure methodically. You would hear the creak of the wooden frame, the groan of the ropes, and then the sickening pop of your own body. Ligaments would snap, cartilage would tear, and joints in the shoulders, elbows, hips, and knees would be pulled from their sockets. The human body was not meant to stretch this way, and the rack pushed it far beyond its breaking point. A scribe would stand by, ready to record any confession, any name whispered between screams. The third of the primary methods was the toca, also known as the water torture. While it may sound less violent than the strapado or the rack, for many it was the most terrifying of all. The victim was strapped to a ladder or a specialized rack, with their head positioned lower than their feet to increase the effect. Their jaws were forced open, often with an iron prong. A linen cloth, the toca, was then placed over their mouth and pushed deep into their throat. Now the torture began. Water, sometimes from a great height to increase the force, was slowly and deliberately poured onto the cloth. The linen would become saturated, swelling to block the passage of air. The victim, unable to breathe, would begin to choke and gag, experiencing the visceral, primal panic of drowning. They would struggle against their bonds, their lungs burning for air that would not come. The torturers were masters of their craft. They would pour just enough water to bring the victim to the brink of asphyxiation, then stop, allowing them to catch a desperate, ragged breath before starting the process all over again. The cycle of suffocation and revival could be repeated multiple times, shattering the victim's will and creating a desperate craving for the torture to end, often leading to a confession of anything the inquisitors wanted to hear. It's important to note that many of the devices we commonly associate with the Inquisition, like the gruesome Iron Maiden or the Pear of Anguish, were likely not used by the Spanish Inquisition. These were either creations of later fiction or were used in secular legal systems in other parts of Europe. The true horror of the Inquisition wasn't in a vast, imaginative array of bizarre devices. It was in the cold, systematic, and legally sanctioned application of these three brutally effective methods: the garrocha, the patro, and the toca. The purpose of this agony was singular: to produce a confession. Once a prisoner broke under the strain, screaming their admission of guilt and naming accomplices, the torture would cease. But the ordeal was far from over. A confession extracted under duress was not considered valid on its own. The rules required that it be ratified by the accused at a later time, typically the next day, away from the torture chamber. The prisoner, now broken in body and spirit, would be brought before the inquisitors again. They would be asked to confirm their confession. If they did, their fate was sealed. But what if, in a moment of courage or regret, they recanted? What if they insisted their confession was a lie, forced from them by unbearable pain? This is where the cruel genius of the suspension loophole came into play. The inquisitors would calmly inform the prisoner that since their confession was false, their previous torture session had not achieved its goal of revealing the truth. Therefore, the session was not over. It had merely been suspended. The prisoner would be taken back to the Camara del Tormento to continue where they left off. Faced with this choice, ratify a lie or endure the agony once more, the vast majority of victims gave the inquisitors the confirmation they needed. The confession, whether true or false, served its purpose. It validated the Inquisition's actions, proved the guilt of the accused, and most importantly, often provided a fresh list of names, new heretics to investigate, ensuring the machinery of the Holy Office would never run out of fuel. For the accused, the journey culminated in a grand public ceremony known as the auto da fe, which translates to act of faith. Contrary to popular belief, the auto da fe was not the execution itself. It was a massive, theatrical religious ritual, a public pronouncement of judgment. These events were huge spectacles, sometimes lasting an entire day, attended by royalty and thousands of ordinary citizens. The day would begin with a solemn procession. The condemned prisoners were marched through the city streets, a parade of human misery intended as a warning to all. Each prisoner wore a penitential garment called a sanbenito, a large yellow tunic. The design of the sanbenito communicated the wearer's crime and sentence. Those who had confessed and were reconciled with the church wore a plain yellow tunic. Those sentenced to death wore a sanbenito painted with demonic figures and flames. They also wore a tall, conical hat called a coroza, similarly decorated. The procession would end at a public square, where a large stage had been erected. Hours would be spent on sermons, prayers, and a reading of the sentences. The punishments varied. Some faced financial ruin through fines. Some were sentenced to public flogging. Others were condemned to years of hard labor as galley slaves or imprisonment in the Inquisition's harsh penitentiary prisons. But for those accused of the most serious heresies, or for those who had relapsed after a previous conviction, the sentence was the most severe. The inquisitors would pronounce them relaxed to the secular arm. This was a critical piece of legal and religious theater. The Church maintained that it did not shed blood. By relaxing or handing the condemned over to the state authorities, the Inquisition could claim its hands were clean. It was a pious fiction that everyone understood. Being relaxed to the secular arm meant only one thing: death. The state authorities would then lead the condemned to a place outside the city walls known as the Torquemada, or burning place. Here, the final act of the grim drama would unfold. Those who had repented at the last moment were granted a small mercy. They were garroted, strangled with an iron collar before their bodies were burned. Those who remained defiant to the end were burned alive at the stake. The Spanish Inquisition was not a brief, bloody flash in history. It was a deeply embedded institution that lasted for over 350 years, officially abolished only in 1834. Its impact on Spanish society, culture, and science was profound. It enforced a rigid Catholic orthodoxy, stifling intellectual curiosity and dissent. The constant fear of denunciation created a society where trust was a dangerous luxury. While the pop culture image is one of millions being burned at the stake, modern historical estimates are more conservative. Over its 3.5 centuries, historians estimate that between 3,000 and 5,000 people were executed under the authority of the Spanish Inquisition. But these numbers, stark as they are, fail to capture the full scope of its horror. Hundreds of thousands more were accused, arrested, and subjected to its terrifying process. Their lives were ruined, their property confiscated, their families disgraced, and their spirits crushed. The true legacy of the Inquisition is not just in its death toll, but in its meticulous systemization of fear. It demonstrated how an institution, armed with absolute authority and an unshakable belief in its own righteousness, can justify unimaginable cruelty. It serves as a chilling reminder of the terrifying depths humanity can sink to when dogma is placed above compassion, and when the search for a perceived truth becomes more important than the lives of those it destroys. The shadows of the torture chamber may have faded, but the questions they raise about power, belief, and the nature of justice remain as vital and unsettling as ever. What happens when we allow our fear of the other to grant unchecked power to an authority that claims to know the absolute truth? It's a question history has asked time and time again, and the terrifying answer was written in the dungeons of the Spanish Inquisition.